Hey everybody, we're 10 days away from the election, and I wanted to do this yesterday. I wanted to put out a video updating my electoral map predictions, but being as the final presidential debate is still relatively fresh, it was this past Thursday, and we haven't really gotten a whole lot of polls since then. I kind of wanted to wait and not just put out a video for the sake of putting out a video. I wanted to actually have some numbers to adjust and to back up some of my predictions. So I kind of want to see how polls respond to that final election. I'm definitely going to put one out later this week, definitely before the election, just updating my predictions and giving my final predictions ahead of November 3rd. That said, today I want to go through some of these key battleground states and where they are currently in terms of polling, and I want to compare that to where they were in terms of polling from back in 2016. Now, that's obviously been a point of discussion. A lot of people are interested in the polls and how they are different or similar to how they were in 2016. But before I go through this, I do want to point out that you are going to see a difference in numbers, particularly, you might see similarities in terms of margins. You're going to see differences in terms of percentages, and that's because around this time in 2016, there were many more undecided voters than there are this time this year. I mean, we've already had almost 50 million Americans vote already, so you would expect the amount of undecided voters this election cycle at this point to be far less than what they were in 2016. So you'll see the numbers are a little off in that respect, and that's why this is more of a fun thing to look at. I don't know if there's going to be real meaning to these poll shifts and to these comparisons, but it is fun to look at, and I do want to point them out because in some ways it is relevant to view trends over time and to compare them, especially when you're dealing with a candidate, with an incumbent candidate who ran back in 2016 in Donald Trump. You get to kind of compare those numbers. So let's jump right in. The states I'm going to go through today are the 6 prime battleground states, and those are Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Certainly not the only 6 swing states or battleground states this election cycle, but they're the 6 I want to go through this evening. Let's start in Arizona with the numbers back in 2016. Now, in 2016, today is October 24th. I'm going to point out October 23rd only because on Real Clear Politics, we actually see October 23rd listed there. And if you notice October 23rd, those numbers began to tighten. It still showed Hillary Clinton up on Donald Trump by a little over a point, just over a point. Back on October 23rd, call it about 40% to just around 42%, just under 42%. So a little under a 2-point victory or lead, rather, for Hillary Clinton at this time back in 2016. Those polls eventually started to trend more heavily toward Donald Trump. He ended with a final RCP average of 4-point lead, and he ended up with about a 3.5-point victory. Comparing that to where he is this election cycle, currently Joe Biden has about a 2.5-point lead over Donald Trump, which is just a little bit better, about a point better than Hillary Clinton was performing at this time last general election cycle. And if you notice, trends currently are tightening. Certainly not the tightening that Donald Trump would want at this point in Arizona. He would like a bit of a steeper jump in Arizona. Though we are seeing a little bit of a trickle and a bit of a steep decline there for Vice President Biden. However, we still haven't seen, like I said, how the final debate will play and how these polls will react. I'm simply going by what they are right now. And in Arizona, at least, those numbers are pretty close in terms of how they were back in 2016, off by just a bit of an advantage here. Donald Trump just underperforming in terms of margin from where he was at back in 2016. On to Florida. Florida, of course, one of the most important swing states, battleground states in this and most other elections. Donald Trump will certainly need Florida if he wants a plausible path to retain the White House. So let's go to that October 23rd, marker, and we see that Donald Trump around that date was at just over 43%, call it 43.5%, to Hillary Clinton's upward of 46.5 point lead, almost at 47%. So about a 47% to about a 43.5% lead for Hillary Clinton. About 4 points, 3.5 point lead at this time. Last election cycle for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. Now, it would eventually tighten and Donald Trump would take an RCP average final lead of just about 0.2 points. And he would win the state of Florida by just over a point. Now, where is he right now against Vice President Biden? Well, he is trailing by about 1.5 points. So that is performing about a point, a little over a point better than this election cycle for Donald Trump, where he currently is trailing Biden, like I said, by 1.5 points in a race that took a bad turn for President Trump. Following the first presidential debate, he has since recovered from that performance, and polls have tightened to where they were pre-first debate. And now we see what happens in Florida. Donald Trump hoping he can keep that momentum going for him. He is currently performing just a bit better at this time than he was at this time in 2016. On to the state of Michigan. One of the two bigger upset wins, three if you consider Pennsylvania, but one of the two biggest upset wins for Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton, as he was trailing by a significant margin, a fairly significant margin at this time back in 2016. He was just about at 35% to Hillary Clinton's 44%, about an 8 or a 9 point lead for Hillary Clinton at this time last election cycle. And Hillary Clinton, while Donald Trump would climb from that 8 or 9 point lead to tighten the polls, Clinton would still go into election night with a 3.5 point lead in terms of the RCP average of polls. Donald Trump won that state by a mere 0.3 points. Now, in this election cycle so far, we have a closer margin in the state of Michigan by just a bit. Joe Biden leading still by about, honestly, about a similar margin, depending which dates you're taking. It could be a point better at most for Donald Trump, maybe a 0.5 point better performance, but not really a significantly better performance right now for Donald Trump than where he was back in 2016. Very similar margins. Only real difference here is how the trends are looking. Donald Trump has steadily been declining in the polls since early October in Michigan, while Joe Biden has steadily been rising. We'll have to see what the latest debate shows in the state of Michigan, but right now it shows Joe Biden in a driver's seat in this state, performing about where Hillary Clinton was. But again, those polls tightened for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump back in 2016. Joe Biden hoping to avoid that kind of tightening race as we wind down this election clock. Let's move on to the state of North Carolina. I put that maybe not hand in hand with Florida, but it's among Florida with a state that Donald Trump absolutely has to win, a battleground that he absolutely has to win. There are scenarios he can afford, I guess, to lose in North Carolina, but I just don't see many plausible paths for him if he loses the state of North Carolina. Back in 2016 at this time, he was trailing about 43%, 43.5% to 46%, about a 2.5 point lead for Hillary Clinton at this time back in 2016. Those polls would eventually get to the point where Donald Trump had a 1 point lead on election night and eventually took home about a 4 point victory in the state of North Carolina. But again, at this time, last election cycle was trailing by about 2.5 points. Currently, Joe Biden has a 1.5 point lead over Donald Trump. So again, about a point better performance so far for Donald Trump this time as it was this time in 2016 here in the state of North Carolina. And similar to Florida, you see that bump from that first debate for Joe Biden. Polls were very tight, within a half point before the first presidential debate between Biden and Trump. And since that, polls widened drastically. Now we see, similar to Florida, how Donald Trump is climbing back in that state. However, the difference between North Carolina and Florida is we've kind of seen a steeper increase for President Trump than in Florida, which was more of a recovery than an increase. We have seen more than a recovery from Donald Trump and actually a tick higher in terms of polls. So a good sign for Donald Trump in North Carolina, as well as about a point better performance than he was doing back in 2016. Moving on to the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, a state for Hillary Clinton that at this time in 2016, she had a fairly significant lead in as well. Donald Trump was at about 40.5%, while Hillary Clinton stood at around 46%. So that's about a 5.5 point advantage for Secretary Clinton back this time in 2016. Polls would eventually tighten to the point where Clinton had just about a 2 point lead on election night, a state that Trump won by just about a point. So again, though that shows a significant tightening of the polls, but around this time in 2016, Hillary Clinton was up about 5.5. And let's take a look at what that is currently between Trump and Biden. Joe Biden has a 5 point lead, just over a 5 point lead. So again, pretty similar in terms of this time back in 2016 in how the polls showed the race going in Pennsylvania. And if we look at trends, we see that since that first presidential debate, the Biden bump has kind of gone down. We haven't really seen much of a spike, maybe about a point and a half point spike for Donald Trump. It's been more of a decline from the Biden bump he got after the first debate. And it, still shows a fairly significant margin for Joe Biden, about the same margin as Hillary Clinton's, which eventually dropped. But right now, it is a fairly significant lead for Vice President Biden in the state of Pennsylvania, similar to how it was for Secretary Clinton. Again, those polls narrowed as we got close to Election Day, and that's something we'll be watching for in Pennsylvania that Vice President Biden hopes doesn't occur. And finally, we go on to the state of Wisconsin, probably the biggest, I wouldn't say probably, the biggest upset in terms of polling back in the 2016 election. Before we go on to where it was back at this time in 2016, just take a look at that RCP average from election night. Clinton was projected to win by about 6.5 points. Donald Trump won that state by almost a point. That's about a 7-point swing in favor of Donald Trump from the polls, deviant from the polls. So that is just the significance of that kind of an upset back in 2016. But now back to where it was at this time in 2016. Donald Trump hovered around 38% of the vote, where Secretary Clinton held about 45% of the vote, about a 7-point lead, 6 to 7 point lead for Hillary Clinton at this time. And it would actually widen just a bit before tightening a little bit and staying fairly consistent throughout. So it went from about a 6 to 7 point lead to a 6.5 point lead on election night. So it really did not change from this time to election night back in 2016. Let's see where it stands right now in the state of Wisconsin. And as you can see, it is narrower. Joe Biden has just about a 4.5 point lead compared to about a 6 to 7 point lead that Hillary Clinton possessed back in 2016. So that's much narrower, and where that might be for a number of reasons, it's also just the fact that this is also a state that Donald Trump won back in 2016. You imagine pollsters have given thought to how wrong they were and tried to correct the mistakes that they must have made polling in a state like Wisconsin. So I want to believe that they're correcting those mistakes and trying to make this much more accurate this time around. And it does show a tighter race in Wisconsin than we saw back in 2016 at this time, about a 4.5 point lead for Joe Biden. And as we can see, fairly significant, fairly static, static polling numbers from Wisconsin. We really did not see much, if any, of the impact of the first presidential debate, for example, on polling in Wisconsin. And that would lead me to wonder if we'll see much, if any, of a bump in either direction from this last presidential debate, or if we're just destined to see Wisconsin static throughout until election night, and then maybe it surprises us again, maybe it doesn't. But right now, Donald Trump will be happy to look at the polling in Wisconsin, at least compared to where he was back in 2016, as it shows him performing just a bit better than back in 2016. So there you go. You read into it as much or as little as you want. I think there's an argument to be made from both camps. Certainly Donald Trump and his camp will look at these numbers and say he's in a better position than he was at this time in 2016, where the other side, Joe Biden and his camp, will say this is right where they want to be, leading in most of these, actually all of the ones I've showed, but leading in most battleground states and leading by a fairly significant margin, assuming polls are more accurate than they were back in 2016. So I think there's a spin to be had in either camp based on this. Again, make your own decisions as to what you want to take away from these numbers. If anything, it is interesting to look at, and it'll be definitely interesting to look at the trends close to election as we get closer and closer to that November 3rd election, compared to where we are now, compared to how the polls tightened back in 2016. Again, we have 10 days left to go. I'm excited. I'll have some more videos coming out this week. And the big one for me is going to be that final election poll, that final election map, rather. I'll try to do my best to make it as accurate as possible, and try to make a video as well after November 3rd or after we have final results from each state, which probably will not be on November 3rd, and compare how my map turned out compared to the actual map once we figure out what that is. But thank you guys for watching. 10 days to the election. Go vote.